The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in May of 1882, informing Clara Whitmore that her inheritance consisted of nothing more than a dilapidated hat shop in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, and her late aunt's collection of silk flowers that had seen better days. Clara stood on the dusty Main Street with her 2 leather trunks, staring at the faded sign that read Whitmore Millinery, and wondering if she had made the worst decision of her 22 years by leaving Philadelphia for this God-forsaken desert town, where the sun beat down like a punishment and tumbleweeds seemed to have more direction in life than she did. The shop smelled of dust and old fabric when she pushed open the door, and Clara fought back tears as she surveyed the bare shelves and the single work table covered in mouse droppings. Her aunt had written such lovely letters about the thriving business, about the sophisticated ladies of Tombstone who appreciated fine craftsmanship, but those letters had apparently been generous interpretations of reality. The truth was far grimmer. Through the grimy window, Clara watched the town's residents pass by, and she noticed something immediately. Every woman wore the same style of plain, practical bonnet or simple, wide-brimmed hat. There was no color, no decoration, no artistry whatsoever. Clara spent 3 days cleaning the shop, scrubbing every surface until her hands were raw and her back ached. She unpacked her trunks, revealing the treasures she had brought from Philadelphia. Bolts of ribbon in every color imaginable, ostrich feathers dyed in brilliant hues, silk flowers that looked real enough to fool a bee, delicate lace from Belgium, and beadwork that caught the light like captured stars. Her former employer, Madame Rousseau, had taught her everything about the millinery trade, and Clara had a gift for design that Madame had called extraordinary. In Philadelphia, society ladies had waited months for one of Clara's custom creations, but Tombstone was not Philadelphia. On her 4th day in town, Clara arranged her first display in the shop window. She had stayed up all night creating 3 hats that she hoped would announce her arrival and her intentions. The first was a deep burgundy felt hat with a wide brim, decorated with cream-colored roses and trailing ribbons. The second was a smaller bonnet in emerald green with peacock feathers arranged in an elegant fan. The third, her masterpiece, was a confection of pale blue silk with white lace, tiny bluebirds nestled among clouds of tulle, and silver beading that sparkled in the morning sun. Clara stepped back onto the street to admire her work, her heart swelling with pride. This was what she did best. This was art. "Would you look at that nonsense?" a sharp voice said behind her. Clara turned to find 3 women standing together, their faces pinched with disapproval beneath their plain bonnets. The speaker was a thin woman with gray streaks in her brown hair and eyes like flint. "I am Clara Whitmore," Clara said, forcing a smile. "I have just taken over my aunt's shop, and I hope to introduce some new styles to Tombstone." "New styles," the woman repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is a respectable town, not some fancy eastern city. We do not need such frivolous displays." "They are just hats," Clara said, her smile faltering. "They are ridiculous," another woman chimed in, younger but equally severe. "No decent woman would wear such things. You will find no customers here for those monstrosities." The 3 women walked away, their heads together in animated conversation, and Clara felt her cheeks burning. She stood there for a long moment, torn between running back inside to hide and standing her ground. She chose to stand. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara discovered that those 3 women, led by the formidable Mrs. Cunningham, were merely the beginning of her troubles. Every day she sat in her shop, working on new designs, and every day people stopped to stare at her window display with expressions ranging from bewilderment to outright mockery. Children pressed their noses to the glass and giggled. Men made jokes as they passed. Women whispered behind their hands and hurried their daughters away as if the hats might somehow corrupt them. "Too fancy for the likes of us," one woman said loudly enough for Clara to hear through the open door. "Who does she think she is, bringing those city airs out here?" Another complained. Clara tried different approaches. She created simpler designs, then more elaborate ones, hoping to find the sweet spot that would appeal to Tombstone's residents. She made bonnets with just a touch of ribbon, hats with a single feather, even plain straw hats with the barest hint of decoration. Nothing worked. The mockery continued, and her shelves remained full while her cash box remained empty. By the beginning of June, Clara was running out of money and options. She had enough to last another month, maybe 2 if she was very careful, and then she would have to admit defeat and return to Philadelphia with her tail between her legs. The thought made her stomach churn with humiliation. She was sitting at her work table on a Wednesday afternoon, trying to repair a hat that a customer had brought in, the first actual work she had been offered since arriving, when the shop door opened. Clara looked up, hope flaring in her chest, but it died when she saw who had entered. The cowboy was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore typical ranch clothing: dusty denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, a brown vest, and scuffed boots with worn spurs. His hat, a standard wide-brimmed affair that had seen better days, was pushed back on his head, revealing eyes the color of warm honey. He looked to be in his mid-20s, and there was something in his expression, a kind of thoughtful intensity that made Clara sit up straighter. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep the weariness from her voice. "I hope so, ma'am," he said, and his voice was deep and soft with the slight drawl of someone who had spent his life out west. "I am looking to buy a hat," Clara blinked. "A hat?" "Yes, ma'am. I saw your display window and I was mighty impressed by your work. Those are the finest hats I have ever seen." For a moment, Clara could only stare at him, certain this was some kind of cruel joke, but his expression was entirely sincere, his eyes warm and honest. "You want to buy one of the hats from my window, if they are for sale, yes, ma'am. They are all ladies' hats," Clara said slowly. "I know that." He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him suddenly, startlingly handsome. "I want to buy one to wear myself." Now Clara was certain this was a joke, probably arranged by Mrs. Cunningham or one of the other vindictive gossips who had made her life miserable. "Sir, I do not appreciate being made fun of. If you are here to mock me like everyone else in this town, I would ask you to leave." The cowboy's smile faded, replaced by a look of genuine hurt. "I am not mocking you, Miss Whitmore. I swear it on my mother's grave. I think your hats are beautiful and I want to buy one. To wear? Yes, ma'am." Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "Because I have watched you sitting in this shop every day for 2 weeks, and I have seen the way this town treats you. I have seen the mockery and the cruelty, and it makes me angry. You are an artist, Miss Whitmore. Your work is extraordinary, and if wearing one of your hats might show this narrow-minded town that there is nothing wrong with beauty and creativity, then I consider it money well spent." Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You would subject yourself to ridicule for me?" "I have been ridiculed for worse reasons," he said with a slight shrug. "Besides, I happen to think it would be an honor to wear something you created. My name is Jack Brennan, and I work as a foreman at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north of town. I came into Tombstone today specifically to visit your shop." "You did?" "I did. So, Miss Whitmore, will you sell me a hat?" Clara stood slowly, still half convinced this was all some elaborate prank, but something in Jack Brennan's eyes made her want to believe him. "Which one would you like?" "The blue one with the birds. That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "That is also the most expensive and the most elaborate. If you truly mean to do this, perhaps you should start with something simpler." Jack shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. If I am going to do this, I am going to do it right. The blue one, please." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the hat from the window. It was her favorite creation, the one she had poured her heart into during that first long night in Tombstone. She had imagined it being worn by some sophisticated lady at an Eastern garden party, not by a cowboy in the Arizona desert. But as she held it out to Jack Brennan, she realized that maybe this was exactly where it was meant to be. "It costs $15, she said, naming a price that was actually below what such a hat would fetch in Philadelphia, but more than most working men could afford. Jack did not even blink. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his vest pocket and counted out the bills, placing them on the counter. "It is worth every penny." Clara took the money with shaking hands and carefully placed the hat in a box lined with tissue paper, but Jack stopped her. "No need for that, ma'am. I am going to wear it now." "Now? You mean right now?" "Yes, ma'am. No point in doing things halfway." Before Clara could protest, Jack had removed his old hat and placed it on the counter. He took the blue silk creation from her hands with surprising gentleness and settled it on his head. The effect was absolutely absurd and somehow absolutely perfect. The delicate blue silk and white lace, the tiny bluebirds and tulle clouds, the silver beading that sparkled in the afternoon light, all of it perched on the head of a sun-weathered cowboy who stood in her shop with his shoulders back and his head high, as if he were wearing a crown. "How do I look?" Jack asked, and there was a hint of humor in his voice but no mockery, only genuine curiosity. Clara could not help it. She laughed, not in mockery but in sheer delight and disbelief at the wonderful absurdity of it all. "You look ridiculous," she said honestly, "and brave and kind." "And absolutely extraordinary," Jack grinned. "Good enough for me. Thank you, Miss Whitmore. I will treasure this hat." "Wait," Clara said as he turned toward the door. "You cannot seriously mean to walk out there wearing that. The whole town will laugh at you." "Let them laugh. I have survived worse than laughter." He picked up his old hat from the counter and tucked it under his arm. "Besides, sometimes the only way to change people's minds is to show them there is nothing to be afraid of. Your hats are not ridiculous, Miss Whitmore. This town's reaction to them is what is ridiculous." And with that, Jack Brennan walked out of Clara's shop and onto the main street of Tombstone, wearing a lady's hat adorned with bluebirds and tulle, his head held high and his stride confident. Clara rushed to the window to watch, her heart pounding. Within seconds, people began to notice. A group of men standing outside the saloon fell silent, their jaws dropping. Two women across the street stopped mid-conversation, staring. A child pointed and started to laugh, but his mother shushed him, looking confused. Jack walked straight down the middle of the street, tipping his old hat to people he passed, completely ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him like a dust cloud. Mrs. Cunningham emerged from the general store, took one look at Jack, and her face turned an alarming shade of purple. "Mr. Brennan, what on earth do you think you are doing?" Jack stopped and turned to face her, touching the brim of Clara's hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cunningham. I am wearing my new hat. Do you like it? I purchased it from Miss Whitmore's shop. She is a true artist." "You are wearing a woman's hat," Mrs. Cunningham sputtered. "Have you lost your mind?" "No, ma'am, I do not believe I have. I am simply wearing a beautiful hat made by a talented milliner. I see no shame in appreciating fine craftsmanship." He smiled pleasantly and continued on his way, leaving Mrs. Cunningham standing on the sidewalk, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Clara watched until Jack disappeared around a corner, and then she sank into her chair, her hands pressed to her mouth. She did not know whether to laugh or cry. No one had ever done anything like that for her. No one had ever stood up for her art so publicly, so fearlessly. And she did not even know this man beyond a 15-minute conversation and a purchased hat. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. People began coming into the shop, not to buy anything but to ask about the cowboy in the fancy hat. Who was he? Why had he done it? Was it a bet? Was he simple-minded? Clara defended Jack's sanity and his character, though she barely knew him, and sent the busybodies away without any real answers. As the sun began to set, Clara was preparing to close the shop when the door opened again. This time it was a young woman, probably around 18 or 19, with honey blonde hair and a sweet face. She wore a simple calico dress and a plain bonnet, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. "Miss Whitmore, I am Sarah Mitchell. I work at the hotel down the street. I saw what Mr. Brennan did today, and I think it was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed. I was wondering if I could look at your hats. I do not have much money, but I have been saving my wages, and I have always wanted something beautiful to wear." Clara felt her eyes sting with sudden tears. "Of course. Please come in." Sarah spent nearly an hour in the shop, trying on different hats and exclaiming over the details. Finally, she chose a simple straw hat with yellow ribbons and a cluster of white daisies. It cost $3, which was clearly a significant portion of Sarah's savings, but the girl's face glowed with happiness as Clara wrapped it carefully. "I am going to wear it to church on Sunday," Sarah declared. "And if anyone says anything mean about it, I am going to tell them that beauty is nothing to be ashamed of." After Sarah left, Clara locked the shop door and climbed the narrow stairs to the small living quarters above the store. The rooms were sparse and hot, but they were hers, and for the first time since arriving in Tombstone, Clara felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Maybe things could change. Maybe Jack Brennan's extraordinary gesture would make a difference. She lay awake that night, thinking about the cowboy with the warm honey eyes who had walked down the main street wearing a blue silk hat with bluebirds and silver beading. She wondered where he was now, if he was at the ranch, if he had really kept the hat on all day, or if he had removed it as soon as he left town. She wondered why he had done it, really done it, beyond his pretty words about art and beauty, and she wondered if she would ever see him again. The next morning, Clara opened the shop to find a small crowd gathered outside. Her heart sank, expecting more mockery, but instead she found 5 women waiting to come in. They were younger women, mostly, probably in their late teens and early 20s, and they all had the same look in their eyes that Sarah Mitchell had worn, curiosity mixed with defiance. "We heard about Mr. Brennan," one of them said, "and about Sarah buying a hat. We want to see what you have." By noon, Clara had sold 4 more hats and taken orders for 3 custom pieces. The women spoke in hushed, excited voices as if they were part of a rebellion, which in a way they were. Word spread quickly in a small town, and not all of it was positive. Mrs. Cunningham and her circle of friends made their disapproval loudly known, standing outside the shop and making pointed comments about frivolity and vanity and women who did not know their place. But Clara had made more money in one morning than she had in the previous 3 weeks combined, and her heart felt lighter than it had since leaving Philadelphia. Jack Brennan returned on Friday afternoon. Clara was working on a custom order when the door opened, and she looked up to find him standing there, still wearing the blue hat with the bluebirds. It looked slightly worse for wear, with a layer of dust and one of the ribbons coming loose, but he wore it with the same pride as the day he bought it. "Mr. Brennan," Clara said, standing quickly, "you are still wearing it. I told you I would treasure it, Miss Whitmore. I do not make promises I cannot keep." He removed the hat carefully and held it out to her. "But I was hoping you might be able to repair this ribbon. It caught on a fence post yesterday, and I do not want it to get any worse." Clara took the hat, her fingers brushing against his, and felt a strange flutter in her stomach. "Of course, it will only take a moment. Please sit down." Jack settled into the chair across from her work table, looking around the shop with interest. "You have been busy. I heard you have been selling hats." "Thanks to you," Clara said, threading a needle. "What you did, Mr. Brennan, it meant everything. I still cannot quite believe you did it." "Why is that so hard to believe?" Clara looked up from her work, studying his face. "Because you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You must have been ridiculed terribly." Jack shrugged. "Some men at the saloon made jokes. A few folks questioned my sanity, but most people were just confused, which I count as a victory. Confusion is better than automatic rejection. It means they are thinking, and thinking is the first step toward changing. You are a philosopher, Mr. Brennan. Just Jack, please, and I am no philosopher. I am just a man who knows something about being an outsider." "How so?" Jack was quiet for a moment, watching her nimble fingers work on the ribbon. My mother was Apache. My father was a white rancher. That makes me something that neither side fully accepts. I have spent my whole life being too Indian for white folks and too white for the Apache. You learn to develop a thick skin, but you also learn to recognize when someone else is being treated unfairly. What this town has done to you, the way they have mocked your work without even trying to understand it, that is wrong. I wanted to do something about it. Clara tied off the thread and smoothed the ribbon back into place. Your mother is she. She died when I was 12. Fever. My father passed 2 years later. Broken heart, the doctor said, though I think it was more the whiskey. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. I have been on my own since I was 14. Worked my way up from stable hand to foreman at the Double R. Mr. Richardson, the owner, he is a fair man. He does not care about my blood, only about my work. I am sorry about your parents, Clara said softly, handing him the repaired hat. Thank you. But we all carry loss, do we not? What brought you to Tombstone, if you do not mind my asking? You seem like you should be in one of those fancy eastern cities, creating hats for society ladies. Clara found herself telling him everything. About her parents' deaths from typhoid when she was 17. About working her way into Madame Rousseau's shop. About her dreams of opening her own millinery someday. About the letter from a lawyer informing her of her aunt's death, and the unexpected inheritance that had seemed like fate offering her exactly what she wanted. But I did not account for the fact that not everyone appreciates beauty the way I do, Clara finished, or that a small western town might not be ready for what I have to offer. They are ready, Jack said firmly. They just do not know it yet. Change takes time, Miss Whitmore. You have been here less than a month. Give it time, Clara. Please, just Clara, Jack smiled. Clara, that is a pretty name, it suits you. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Clara learned that Jack loved books, especially poetry, and that he had taught himself to read using his mother's Bible and whatever newspapers he could get his hands on. Jack learned that Clara had always wanted to see the ocean, and that she secretly wrote stories in a journal she kept hidden under her mattress. They talked about the desert, and the sky and the way the light looked at sunset over the mountains. They talked about everything and nothing, and when Jack finally stood to leave, Clara felt a pang of disappointment. I should get back to the ranch, Jack said reluctantly, but I will be in town again next week. May I visit you again? I would like that very much, Clara said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. Jack settled the blue hat back on his head, adjusting it with care. Thank you for repairing my hat, Clara. Thank you for buying it, Jack. Thank you for everything. After he left, Clara stood at the window and watched him mount a buckskin horse tied outside the general store. Even from a distance, she could see the way people stared as he rode past, the blue silk hat brilliant against the dusty street. And she realized, with a start that made her breath catch, that she was already looking forward to seeing him again. The following Sunday, Sarah Mitchell wore her yellow-ribboned hat to church, and 4 other young women wore hats they had purchased from Clara's shop. The reaction was predictable. Mrs. Cunningham stood up during the social hour after the service and delivered a speech about modesty and vanity, about the corruption of young minds by Eastern influences, about the need to maintain proper standards in a civilized community. But her words fell flat because the women wearing Clara's hats stood together, their heads high, refusing to be shamed. I bought this hat with my own money, Sarah said clearly, and I will wear what I please. There is nothing immodest about a pretty hat, Mrs. Cunningham. The only thing immodest here is your attempt to control what other women do with their own lives and wages. The church hall fell silent. Then, slowly, several older women began to nod. Not everyone agreed with Mrs. Cunningham, Clara realized. Many had simply been afraid to speak up. But Sarah's words had opened a door and other voices began to join hers. By Monday morning, Clara had a line of customers waiting outside her shop. Over the next few weeks, Clara's business flourished. She worked from dawn until well after dark, creating custom hats and filling orders. The young women of Tombstone had embraced her designs with enthusiasm, and gradually, some of the older, more conservative women began to soften as well. A banker's wife ordered a subdued gray hat with just a touch of black lace. The schoolteacher commissioned a green bonnet with small white flowers. Even some of the saloon girls came by, wanting elaborate creations with bright feathers and bold colors. Jack visited every time he came to town, which was about twice a week. Sometimes he needed supplies for the ranch. Sometimes he claimed to need repairs on his hat, though Clara suspected he just wanted an excuse to see her. And sometimes he simply stopped by to talk. They fell into an easy friendship that felt both comfortable and charged with something Clara could not quite name, but felt in the flutter of her pulse every time he walked through her door. He still wore the blue hat everywhere, despite the continued stares and occasional crude comments. Clara made him a second hat, a more masculine design in dark brown felt with a simple band of leather and a single eagle feather, but Jack refused to wear it. "The blue one is special," he insisted. "It was the first. It means something." "It means you are stubborn," Clara teased. "That too," Jack agreed with a grin. In early July, Clara was invited to the Independence Day celebration in the town square. She arrived wearing her finest dress, a lavender silk she had brought from Philadelphia, and a new hat she had created for herself. A wide-brimmed straw with clusters of purple wildflowers. She felt self-conscious walking through the crowds, aware of the attention her hat drew, but then Jack appeared at her side, still wearing the blue creation with the bluebirds, and offered her his arm. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the warmth in his eyes made Clara's cheeks flush. They spent the afternoon together, eating food from the various booths, watching the children's games, and listening to the town band play patriotic songs with more enthusiasm than skill. Mrs. Cunningham watched them with disapproving eyes, but Clara found she did not care anymore. Let the old woman disapprove. Clara had found her place in Tombstone, and more importantly, she had found Jack. As the sun began to set, Jack led Clara away from the crowds to a quiet spot at the edge of the square where they could see the mountains turning purple in the fading light. "Clara," Jack said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." Clara's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "These past weeks, getting to know you, they have been the happiest of my life. You are talented and brave and kind, and you make me want to be a better man. I know we have not known each other long, but in the West, time moves differently. Life is harder and shorter, and you learn not to waste opportunities when they present themselves." He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I am falling in love with you, Clara Whitmore. I think I started falling that first day in your shop, and every moment since has only made it more certain. I am just a ranch foreman with mixed blood and no real prospects beyond my wages. But if you could see your way to giving me a chance, I would spend every day trying to make you happy." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Jack, you wonderful, impossible man. You bought a lady's hat and wore it through town just to defend my honor. You visit my shop twice a week even though it is 20 miles out of your way. You talk to me about poetry and dreams and the color of the sunset. How could I not fall in love with you?" "Is that a yes?" Jack asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That is a yes," Clara whispered. And then Jack was kissing her, gentle and sweet, and the fireworks that began exploding over the town square seemed like they were just for them. They courted properly after that, though in truth they had been courting all along without putting a name to it. Jack came to town every Sunday after church, and they would walk together through the streets, talking and laughing. He brought her wildflowers from the desert and smooth stones from the creek near the ranch. She made him shirts in colors he had never worn before, deep greens and rich blues, telling him he should have some beauty in his life beyond a single hat. They talked about their dreams and their fears, about the future they wanted to build together. In August, Jack asked Clara to visit the Double R Ranch. He borrowed Mr. Richardson's buggy and drove her out on a Sunday morning, and Clara fell in love with the sprawling property with its herds of cattle and horses, the ranch house built of adobe and wood, and the endless sky that seemed to stretch forever. Jack showed her everything, introducing her to the other ranch hands and the cowboys who worked under him. They treated him with genuine respect, and Clara saw how much he had accomplished, rising from an orphaned boy with mixed heritage to a trusted foreman. Mr. Richardson has been talking about selling me a piece of the land, Jack told her as they sat on the porch of the bunkhouse, watching the sun set. About 60 acres on the eastern edge of the property. He would carry the note, let me pay it off over time. I have been saving my wages for years, and I almost have enough for a down payment. I could build a house there, Clara, start my own small ranch. It would not be much at first, but it would be ours. Ours, Clara repeated softly. Jack turned to her, his honey-colored eyes intense. Marry me, Clara. I know it is fast, and I know you deserve a long courtship with fancy parties and proper courting rituals, but I cannot imagine my life without you. Marry me, and we will build a life together. You can keep your shop in town, or you can work from home if you prefer. Whatever you want, wherever you want to be, as long as we are together. Clara's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, Jack, I will marry you. They were married in September, in the same church where Sarah Mitchell had defied Mrs. Cunningham by wearing a yellow-ribboned hat. Clara wore a dress she sewed herself, cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, and a hat that was her masterpiece. White silk and tulle with tiny seed pearls and silk orange blossoms, delicate and beautiful. Jack wore his best suit, which they had purchased together from the general store, and of course, the blue hat with the bluebirds. The church was full. All of Clara's customers came, along with the ranch hands from the Double R, and even some of the people who had initially mocked her work. Sarah Mitchell served as Clara's bridesmaid, and Tom Richardson, the ranch owner, stood up as Jack's best man. Mrs. Cunningham attended but sat in the back row with her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval, which everyone politely ignored. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the town square with food and music and dancing. Clara danced with her husband, her heart so full she thought it might overflow, and when Jack kissed her in front of everyone, she did not care who was watching. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Tombstone, in the finest room Sarah could prepare for them. Clara had been nervous, but Jack was gentle and patient, and their coming together felt like the natural conclusion of everything that had built between them over the past months. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, talking in whispers until dawn. I still cannot believe you wore that hat for me, Clara murmured, tracing patterns on Jack's chest. That first day I thought you were insane. Maybe I was, Jack said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Insane with the need to do something, anything, to help you. I had been watching you for days, seeing the way you tried so hard to be brave even though this town was breaking your heart. And then I looked at that blue hat in your window and I thought, what if I just showed them it was not something to be afraid of? What if I made myself the target instead of you? You are the bravest man I have ever known. No, Jack said softly. You are the brave one. You came out here alone to a strange town and you refused to compromise your art even when everyone told you to. You stood your ground, Clara. I just gave you a little support. A little support, Clara repeated with a laugh. You wore a lady's hat covered in bluebirds and silver beading through the streets of Tombstone. That is not a little support, Jack. That is grand, romantic, absolutely ridiculous gesture, and I love you for it. I love you too, Jack said. And I will wear that hat every day for the rest of my life if it makes you smile like you are smiling right now. They moved into a small house in town temporarily, while Jack worked on building their home on the 60 acres he had purchased from Mr. Richardson. Clara kept her shop open, and business continued to grow. Women from surrounding towns and ranches began to hear about the talented milliner in Tombstone, and Clara found herself taking orders from as far as Tucson. She hired Sarah Mitchell as her assistant, teaching the younger woman the trade. And together they filled the shop with color and beauty. Jack worked from dawn to dusk, building their house with his own hands and the help of the other cowboys from the Double R. It was hard work, but he seemed to thrive on it. Every Sunday, he would take Clara out to the property to show her the progress. She watched the walls go up, the roof take shape, the windows get installed. Jack built her a large, bright workroom on the south side of the house where she could create her hats, with big windows that let in the desert light. In November, they moved into the finished house. It was simple but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh desert weather, and Clara filled it with handmade curtains and cushions, with flowers in mason jars and books on shelves Jack had built. She set up her workroom and immediately began creating, inspired by the vast sky and the wild beauty of the landscape around them. Life fell into a rhythm. Jack worked his land, building up a small herd of cattle and horses. Clara divided her time between her shop in town and her workroom at home. They made the trip into Tombstone twice a week, and Clara always spent at least a few hours at the shop, meeting with customers and working with Sarah. The rest of the time, she worked from home, and she found she loved the solitude and the space to think and create without interruption. Jack still wore the blue hat, though it was getting quite battered now. Clara had repaired it a dozen times, replacing ribbons and reattaching flowers and birds that had come loose. She offered multiple times to make him a new hat, something fresh and beautiful, but Jack always refused. "This is our hat," he would say. "The one that brought us together. I will wear it until it falls apart completely, and even then I will probably hang it on the wall and look at it every day." In the spring of 1883, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Jack on a Sunday morning, and he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. They spent the day making plans and dreaming about the future, about the child they would raise together in this wild, beautiful place. "Boy or girl, it does not matter," Jack said, his hand resting gently on Clara's still flat stomach. "As long as the baby is healthy." "And loved," Clara added. "Our child will be so loved, Jack." The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was brutal, and Clara struggled with sickness and exhaustion. But Jack was attentive and caring, doing everything he could to make her comfortable. Sarah took over most of the shop work, proving herself more than capable, and Clara focused on preparing for the baby. In November, after a long and difficult labor, Clara gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas after Jack's father, and from the moment Clara held him in her arms, she understood a depth of love she had never imagined possible. Thomas had Jack's dark hair and Clara's blue eyes, and he was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. Jack was a devoted father from the start. He would sit for hours holding Thomas, singing old Apache songs his mother had taught him, telling the baby stories about his grandmother and the heritage he would carry. Clara would watch them together, her heart full to bursting, and think about how far they had come from that first day in the hat shop. Mrs. Cunningham came to visit when Thomas was 2 weeks old, bringing a baby blanket she had knitted herself. It was a peace offering of sorts, and Clara accepted it graciously. The older woman held Thomas and looked at Clara with something approaching respect. "You have built a good life here," Mrs. Cunningham said quietly. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Brennan. Wrong about your hats, wrong about your influence on the town. You brought beauty and courage to Tombstone, and we are better for it." "Thank you," Clara said, genuinely moved. "That means more than you know." Over the next few years, the Brennan ranch prospered. Jack's hard work paid off, and their herd grew. Clara's hat business continued to thrive, and she trained 2 more assistants to help Sarah manage the shop. Clara worked mostly from home now, taking custom orders from wealthy clients who were willing to pay premium prices for her unique designs. She sent hats as far as San Francisco and Denver, and her reputation as an artist grew. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic little boy who loved helping his father with the horses and watching his mother create beautiful things from fabric and ribbon. When he was 3, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Ellen, after Clara's mother. Ellen had Jack's honey-colored eyes and a sweet, gentle temperament that melted everyone who met her. Jack still wore the blue hat, though by now it was more patches and repairs than original creation. It had become famous in its own way. Visitors to Tombstone would ask about the cowboy who wore the fancy lady's hat, and people would tell the story of how Jack Brennan had stood up for the milliner who was mocked, how he had worn her creation proudly and helped change the town's mind about beauty and art. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Clara finally convinced Jack to retire the blue hat. It was falling apart beyond repair, the silk shredded by sun and wind and weather, the decorations long since worn away. They held a private ceremony in their bedroom, just the two of them, and Clara carefully wrapped the hat in tissue paper and placed it in a special box. "This hat changed my life," Jack said quietly, looking at the worn blue silk. "The day I walked into your shop and bought this hat, I had no idea what I was starting. I just knew I wanted to help you, but it became so much more than that. It brought us together," Clara said, slipping her arms around his waist. "This ridiculous, beautiful, brave gesture of yours brought us together, and I will be grateful for it every day of my life." She presented him with a new hat then, one she had been working on in secret for months. It was made of the finest materials she could find. Rich blue felt the exact shade of the original, decorated with hand-painted silk birds that looked so real they seemed ready to take flight, silver thread embroidery, and ribbons that shimmered in the lamplight. It was a masterpiece, the culmination of everything she had learned and all the love she felt for her husband. Jack's eyes filled with tears when he saw it. "Clara, it is perfect. You deserve perfect," she said. "You have given me everything, Jack. A home, a family, a life beyond anything I ever dreamed. The least I can do is make sure you have a beautiful hat to wear." Jack wore the new blue hat with the same pride he had worn the original, and it became as much a part of his identity as his name. The Brennan Ranch became known throughout the territory, not just for its quality cattle and horses, but for the man who ran it, the cowboy who wore fancy hats and was not afraid to be different. In 1888, when Thomas was 5 and Ellen was 2, Clara gave birth to twin boys they named James and Daniel. The house that Jack had built with his own hands suddenly felt small, so they added on, building more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Sarah, who had married one of the ranch hands, lived nearby with her own growing family, and the two women remained close friends and business partners. Clara eventually sold her shop in town to Sarah, who ran it successfully while Clara focused on high-end custom work from home. She became known as one of the finest milliners in the West, and her hats were sought after by wealthy women throughout the country. But she never forgot her roots, and she always made sure to create some less expensive designs that working women could afford. Jack expanded the ranch, buying more land as it became available. He was respected throughout the territory as a fair employer and a skilled rancher. His mixed heritage, which had once been a source of shame and difficulty, became a source of pride. He taught his children about their Apache grandmother, about her strength and her traditions, and he made sure they understood the importance of honoring all parts of their heritage. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful young man who loved working the land with his father. Ellen showed early talent for millinery and would spend hours in Clara's workroom, learning the trade. The twins were wild and energetic, keeping both their parents constantly on their toes. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jack and Clara rode out to the spot where they had first kissed, on the edge of the town square where the fireworks had exploded overhead. The town had changed considerably in 10 years. It was larger and more prosperous, with new buildings and businesses. But some things remained the same. Clara's old shop still stood, now with Sarah's name on the sign, and the church where they had married still held services every Sunday. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked, holding Clara's hand as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Leaving Philadelphia, coming out here to this harsh place. Clara turned to look at her husband, at the man who had walked into her shop wearing courage like armor and had bought a blue silk hat just to show her she was not alone. His face was more weathered now, lined by sun and wind and years of outdoor work, but his honey-colored eyes were as warm and kind as they had been that first day. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be, Jack, with you building this life, raising our children." Philadelphia was beautiful, but it was never home. This is home. "I love you," Jack said simply. "Every day I love you more." "I love you too," Clara replied. "My brave, ridiculous, wonderful man who wore a lady's hat to defend my honor. How could I not love you?" They kissed as the sun set, and Clara thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, standing alone on the dusty street of Tombstone with nothing but 2 trunks and a failing hat shop. She thought about the mockery and the loneliness, about the fear that she had made a terrible mistake. And then she thought about Jack walking into her shop, looking at her most elaborate creation, and declaring he wanted to buy it and wear it himself. It had been the most absurd, the most wonderful, the most transformative moment of her life. And everything that came after, all the love and joy and family and success, had grown from that single moment of crazy bravery. By 1895, the Brennan children were growing up fast. Thomas was 17 and had announced his intention to take over the ranch someday. Ellen was 14 and already taking custom hat orders of her own, showing a talent that rivaled her mother's. James and Daniel were 12, still causing mischief but showing signs of the men they would become. Clara was 40 years old now, and though the years had added some gray to her hair and lines to her face, she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her youth. Jack was 43, his hair now more silver than dark, but still strong and capable and devoted to his family. They added a 5th child to their family that year, a surprise baby girl they named Rose, because she came to them late and unexpected and perfect, like a flower blooming in the desert. The children adored their baby sister, and Jack walked around with a permanent smile, carrying Rose everywhere and singing her the same Apache songs he had sung to Thomas all those years ago. The second blue hat, the masterpiece Clara had made for their 5th anniversary, was still in beautiful condition. Jack wore it for special occasions now, and it had been featured in several newspaper articles about the famous rancher and his equally famous Milliner wife. Photographers had come from back east to take pictures of the Brennan family, fascinated by their story. One reporter had asked Jack why he continued to wear such an unusual hat, even after all these years, when it would be easier to wear something more conventional. Jack's answer had been simple. "Because my wife made it for me, and because it represents everything I believe about courage and love and refusing to let other people define who you are. I wore a hat like this one the first time because a talented woman was being mocked for creating beauty, and I wanted to show her that her work mattered. I wear this one now to remind myself and everyone else that the best things in life come when you are brave enough to be different." The article had been syndicated across the country, and Clara's business had exploded as a result. She could barely keep up with the orders, even with Ellen's help and Sarah's shop in town producing some of the simpler designs. Clara eventually trained 3 more young women in the millinery trade, creating jobs and opportunities that had not existed before. In 1900, Thomas married a sweet young woman named Anna from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the far edge of the Brennan property. Clara and Jack became grandparents the following year when Anna gave birth to a daughter, and Jack cried when he held his granddaughter for the first time, thinking about how far he had come from that orphaned boy with nowhere to belong. Ellen opened her own millinery shop in Bisbee, a booming mining town about 30 miles south, and quickly made a name for herself. She had inherited her mother's talent and her father's courage, and she created bold, innovative designs that pushed boundaries while still remaining wearable. James and Daniel decided to go into business together, starting a freight company that transported goods between Tombstone and the surrounding towns. They were natural businessmen, charming and clever, and their company prospered. Rose, growing up surrounded by love and with 4 older siblings who doted on her, showed early signs of being a talented artist. She spent hours drawing and painting, capturing the beauty of the desert landscape around their ranch. Jack and Clara watched their children build their own lives with pride and joy. They had given their children something precious: the freedom to be themselves, the courage to pursue their dreams, and the security of knowing they were loved unconditionally. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, the entire extended family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Thomas and Anna were there with their 3 children. Ellen came from Bisbee with her fiancé, a doctor she had met when he moved to town. James and Daniel brought their sweethearts, 2 sisters from a local family. Rose, now 8 years old, had made decorations for the party with her own hands. Sarah and her family attended, along with Mr. Richardson and many of the ranch hands who had worked for Jack over the years. Even some of Clara's oldest customers from Tombstone made the trip, bringing gifts and good wishes. Jack stood up at dinner to make a toast, and Clara's heart swelled with love as she looked at him. He was 61 years old now, his hair completely silver, his face deeply lined, but to her, he was still the handsome young cowboy who had walked into her shop wearing courage and kindness like a badge. 20 years ago, Jack said, his voice strong and clear, I walked into a hat shop and bought the most elaborate, ridiculous, beautiful ladies hat I had ever seen. The woman who made it thought I was insane. Truth be told, I might have been. But that hat, that single moment of crazy decision-making, led to everything I cherish most in this world. He looked at Clara, his honey-colored eyes still as warm as they had been 2 decades ago. My wife, my partner, my best friend, you took a risk when you came to Tombstone. You refused to compromise your vision even when everyone mocked you. You created beauty in a harsh place, and you made me want to be braver, to be better. These 20 years with you have been the greatest adventure of my life. Turning to address the gathered crowd, Jack continued, We built something here, Clara and I, a family, yes, but more than that. We built a life based on the idea that being different is not something to hide or apologize for. That beauty and art and creativity have value even in a rough frontier town. That standing up for what you believe in matters, even if it means looking foolish in the eyes of others. He raised his glass. To my Clara, who saw a dusty town and a broken-down shop and decided it was worth fighting for. To my children, who inherited their mother's talent and their father's stubbornness. To all of you who supported us and believed in us along the way. And to fancy hats, because sometimes the most ridiculous things turn out to be the most important. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses, and Clara wiped tears from her eyes as she stood to embrace her husband. The party continued late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. Clara danced with Jack under the stars, just as they had at their wedding, and felt the same flutter of joy she had felt then. Later, after the guests had left and the children had gone to bed, Jack and Clara sat on their porch, watching the moon rise over the desert. Jack wore the second blue hat, as he always did for special occasions, and Clara rested her head on his shoulder. It all worked out, did not it? Clara said softly. All the fear and uncertainty and struggle, it all led to this. It did, Jack agreed, kissing the top of her head. Better than I ever could have imagined. Do you remember what you said that first day, about wanting to show the town that there was nothing to be afraid of? I remember. You did more than that, Jack. You showed me that there are still good people in the world. That courage does not always look like what you expect. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is wear a lady's hat covered in bluebirds just to make someone smile. Jack chuckled. When you put it that way, it sounds even more ridiculous than it was. It was perfect, Clara insisted. "You were perfect. You are perfect." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. The ranch would need tending, Clara had orders to fill, the children would come with their questions and their problems and their love. But tonight, there was just this. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together in a harsh and beautiful place, who had created a family and a legacy that would endure. The blue hat with the bluebirds sat on Jack's head, still beautiful after all these years, a symbol of everything they had overcome and everything they had achieved. It was a reminder that sometimes the grandest gestures come from the simplest acts of kindness, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting silver light across the desert, Clara thought about that girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Tombstone so many years ago, terrified and alone and determined to make something of herself. That girl could never have imagined this life, this love, this perfect, chaotic, wonderful family. But she had been brave enough to try, and Jack had been brave enough to stand beside her, wearing a fancy hat and refusing to let the world's mockery stop them from being exactly who they were meant to be. And that, Clara thought as sleep began to claim her, had made all the difference. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons. Jack and Clara grew older together, their hands more gnarled but still reaching for each other, their steps slower but still walking side by side. They watched their children have children of their own, and then those grandchildren began having children. And the family they had started in a dusty hat shop in Tombstone grew into a sprawling clan that filled the ranch house with noise and laughter during holiday gatherings. Thomas took over management of the ranch in 1910 when Jack turned 68 and decided it was time to slow down. But Jack never truly retired. He was out in the fields every day, checking on the cattle, advising Thomas, making sure everything ran smoothly. The second blue hat was retired to a place of honor in the house, but Jack still wore hats Clara made him, always with some special touch that marked them as her creations. Clara continued to create until her hands simply could not manage the delicate work anymore. Even then, she supervised and advised, teaching her granddaughters the millinery trade, passing on the skills and the artistry that had brought her to Tombstone so many years ago. Ellen's shop in Bisbee had expanded into 3 locations, and the Brennan Mitchell millinery business was known throughout the Southwest. In 1915, on a warm September afternoon, Jack and Clara celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. Thomas and Anna had taken the grandchildren for the night, giving them privacy and peace. They ate on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "You remember the first time we sat out here?" Jack asked, his voice softer now but still filled with warmth. "After I asked you to marry me. I remember everything about you, Jack Brennan," Clara said, smiling at her husband. "Every moment, every word, every kindness." "I have had a good life," Jack said quietly. "Better than I ever thought possible for an orphaned half-breed boy with no prospects." "You gave me that, Clara. You and our children and this family we built together." "We gave it to each other," Clara corrected gently. "I was lost before I found you, Jack. My art did not matter if there was no one who understood it, who valued it. You were the first person who saw me, really saw me, and thought I was worth defending." They talked late into the night, sharing memories and laughter, holding hands like young lovers. When they finally went to bed, they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content and peaceful. Jack died in his sleep that night, quietly and without pain, his last moments spent in the arms of the woman he loved. Clara woke to find him gone, and though her heart shattered with grief, there was also a strange sense of peace. They had been given 32 years together, 3 decades of love and partnership and joy. Not everyone was so lucky. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. The Brennan children and grandchildren came, along with ranch hands past and present, business associates, friends, and neighbors. Representatives came from all the surrounding towns, sending condolences and sharing stories about the cowboy who had worn fancy hats, and changed the way people thought about courage and individuality. Clara insisted that Jack be buried wearing the second blue hat, the masterpiece she had created for their 5th anniversary. It seemed only fitting that he should wear it for eternity, this symbol of everything they had meant to each other. After the funeral, Ellen found Clara standing in her workshop, holding the box that contained the original blue hat, the one Jack had bought that very first day. The silk was nearly dust now, the decorations long since fallen away, but Clara held it like the treasure it was. "He was a remarkable man," Ellen said softly, putting her arm around her mother's shoulders. "He was," Clara agreed, tears streaming down her face. "The most remarkable man I have ever known. He walked into my shop on the worst day of my life and made everything better. He wore this ridiculous hat just to show me I was not alone, and that single act of kindness changed everything." "You changed each other," Ellen said. "You made each other brave." Clara nodded, carefully placing the original blue hat back in its box. "I suppose we did. And now I have to learn to be brave without him." It was not easy. The days after Jack's death were some of the hardest of Clara's life. But she was surrounded by love. Her children and grandchildren, Sarah, who visited almost every day, the community that Jack and Clara had helped build over 3 decades. Slowly, painfully, Clara learned to live with the grief. She learned to find joy in small things again. The laughter of her great-grandchildren, the satisfaction of finishing a particularly challenging hat design, the beauty of the desert sunset. She lived for another 8 years, dying peacefully in 1923 at the age of 68. Her children buried her next to Jack, and on her grave they placed a bronze plaque engraved with a blue bird, a small reminder of the hat that had started everything. The Brennan Ranch continued to prosper for generations, passed down through Thomas's line. Ellen's millinery business expanded throughout the Southwest and eventually into California, becoming one of the most successful hat-making operations in the West. James and Daniel's Freight Company grew into a major regional transportation business. Rose became a celebrated painter whose works hung in galleries throughout the country. But more than their business success, more than their wealth or their status, the Brennan family was known for their values: courage, creativity, kindness, and the understanding that being different was not something to hide but something to celebrate. And at the heart of all of it was the story of Jack and Clara, the cowboy and the milliner, and the blue silk hat that had brought them together. The original hat, carefully preserved in a special case, was eventually donated to the Arizona Historical Society, where it remains on display to this day. The placard beside it tells the story of how a mockery turned into love, how a simple act of kindness changed a town, and how 2 people who refused to be anything other than themselves built a legacy that endured long after they were gone. Visitors to the museum stopped to look at the faded silk and the remnants of ribbons and the tiny bluebird that somehow survived decades of wear and weather. They read the story and they smile. Because it is a story about the Wild West, yes, but more than that, it is a story about love. About finding someone who sees your value when the rest of the world does not. About standing up for what you believe in, even when it makes you look foolish. About the courage it takes to be truly yourself in a world that wants everyone to be the same. The blue hat is fragile now, protected behind glass. A reminder of a time when the West was still wild and a cowboy could change everything by wearing a lady's hat. But the love story it represents is as strong as ever, passed down through generations of Brennans who tell their children about their great-great-grandparents, about the milliner who refused to compromise her art, and the cowboy who loved her enough to make himself a target so she could be safe. It is a story about hats and love and courage. But most of all, it is a story about how sometimes the most ridiculous things turn out to be the most important, and how one moment of brave, foolish kindness can echo through time, changing lives and building legacies that last forever. And somewhere, in whatever place Jack and Clara found themselves after death, they walk hand in hand through an eternal sunset. And Jack wears a blue silk hat with bluebirds and silver beading, and Clara smiles with the knowledge that she is loved, has always been loved, will always be loved by the man who wore a fancy hat just to make her feel less alone. Their story became legend in Tombstone and throughout Arizona. Historians wrote papers about their influence on fashion and social norms in the late 19th century West. Their house on the ranch, carefully preserved by their descendants, eventually became a historic site that tourists could visit. The town of Tombstone, so famous for its gunfights and outlaws, added another story to its history. The story of how love and beauty and courage changed a community from the inside out. Every year on the anniversary of their wedding, the town held a celebration. People wore fancy hats, as elaborate and creative as they could imagine, and there was a parade down the main street that ended at the site of Clara's original shop. It became a tradition, a way of honoring the legacy Jack and Clara had left behind, a reminder that standing up for what you believe in, even in small ways, can change the world. The values they instilled in their children lived on. The Brennan family became known throughout Arizona for their philanthropy and their progressive attitudes. They established scholarships for young artists, funded schools, and supported causes that helped marginalized communities. They remembered Jack's mixed heritage and Clara's struggles as an outsider, and they used their success to help others who faced similar challenges. Thomas's great-grandson eventually wrote a book about Jack and Clara, carefully researching their lives through letters, journals, and family stories. The book became a bestseller, introducing their story to a whole new generation. A film was made in the 1950s, though the family felt it took too many liberties with the truth. Still, it brought attention to the real story, and people became fascinated by the cowboy who wore fancy hats and the milliner who loved him. But beyond all the fame and the legend and the historical significance, what mattered most was the simple truth at the center of it all. Two people had found each other in an unlikely place and time, and they had chosen to be brave together. They had faced mockery and hardship, and all the challenges that life in the Wild West could throw at them, and they had done it side by side, supporting each other, loving each other, building something beautiful out of dust and determination. The blue hat was just a hat after all. Silk and ribbon and feathers and thread. But what it represented was everything. It was courage in the face of ridicule. It was standing up for someone who could not stand up for themselves. It was refusing to let the world define who you could be or what you could create. It was love expressed in the most public, vulnerable, ridiculous way possible. And it was proof that sometimes the smallest gestures matter the most. That sometimes wearing a fancy hat is not just about fashion, but about making a statement that echoes through generations. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is show another person that they are not alone, that their dreams matter, that beauty has value even in the harshest places. Jack and Clara Brennan lived and loved and built a family and died, as all people do. But their story lived on, carried forward by everyone who heard it and understood its message. Be brave. Be kind. Stand up for beauty and art and creativity. Do not let fear or mockery stop you from being exactly who you are meant to be. And when you find someone who sees you, really sees you, hold on to them with everything you have. These lessons, simple but profound, were the true legacy of the milliner and the cowboy. Not the business success or the historical significance or the fame that came later, but the fundamental human truths they embodied. That love changes everything, that courage can wear many faces, and that sometimes a fancy hat is exactly what the world needs. Their great-great-great-grandchildren still visit the graves in Tombstone, still place flowers there on anniversaries and holidays. The blue bird on Clara's plaque has been polished smooth by countless hands touching it for luck or inspiration, or simply to feel connected to a story that matters. The hat in the museum is carefully preserved, its fragile beauty protected so that future generations can see it and understand what it represented. And on warm September evenings in Arizona, when the sun sets in shades of orange and pink and purple, people still gather on porches and tell the story of Jack and Clara. They talk about the milliner who was mocked for her fancy hat designs and the cowboy who bought one and wore it proudly for her. They talk about how that single act of courage and kindness blossomed into a love story that changed a town and inspired generations, because that is what the best love stories do. They do not just belong to the people who lived them. They belong to everyone who hears them and recognizes something true and beautiful in the telling. They remind us of who we can be at our best, brave and kind and willing to look foolish for something that matters. Jack and Clara would have been amazed to know how their story endured, how that blue silk hat became a symbol recognized throughout the West and beyond. But they would not have been surprised by the love that sustained it. They knew, from the moment Jack walked into that hat shop wearing courage like armor, that what they had found in each other was rare and precious and worth fighting for. And they did fight for it in their own way. Not with guns or violence, but with quiet determination and unwavering support for each other. They built a life together one day at a time, one hat at a time, one small act of courage at a time. And in doing so, they proved that the wildest West of all was not the desert or the frontier towns or the lawless territories, but the human heart itself, vast and untamed and capable of extraordinary things when given the chance to love freely. The sun set on their lives as it sets on all lives, but the light they created together continues to shine, reflected in the faces of their descendants, in the hats that still bear the Brennan name, in the stories told around campfires and dinner tables, in the blue silk remnants behind museum glass. They were just two people, after all, a milliner from Philadelphia and a cowboy with mixed heritage and nowhere to belong. But together, they became something more. They became proof that love can bloom anywhere, that courage comes in unexpected forms, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is wear a fancy hat when everyone says you should not. And that is a legacy worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth passing down through all the generations to come. Not just as history, but as inspiration. Not just as a story from the past, but as a reminder for the future. Be brave, be kind, love fiercely. And never, ever let anyone tell you that beauty and creativity and being exactly who you are does not matter, because it does matter. Jack and Clara Brennan proved that beyond any doubt. And their blue silk hat, faded and fragile and beautiful still, stands as eternal testimony to the power of one brave gesture, one moment of ridiculous courage, one hat that changed everything.